I didn't know the moment my children would erase me from their lives would come wrapped in a single sentence. If you go on that trip, don't bother calling us ever again. I was standing in my own kitchen when they said it. The same kitchen where I had packed their lunches, wiped their tears, stayed up late sewing costumes, balancing checkbooks, and swallowing exhaustion for nearly 3 decades. The same kitchen where I had learned, slowly and painfully, how invisible a woman could become when everyone expected her to carry everything without complaint. My ex-husband had suffered a stroke, and somehow, despite the divorce papers he handed me 8 years ago, despite the woman he left me for, despite the life I rebuilt from the ground up, I was expected to become his caregiver. Again. They didn't ask gently. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wonder what it might cost me. They assumed, because I lived closer, because I had flexibility, because I was their mother. And mothers apparently never stop paying. When I said no, when I chose my anniversary trip with my husband over bathing, feeding, and medicating the man who once threw my dreams in the trash, my children looked at me like I had committed an unforgivable crime. They told me I was selfish, bitter, cruel. They said I was choosing a vacation over family. What they didn't say, but what hung heavy in the room, was that they believed my happiness was still negotiable, that my boundaries were optional, that the woman who had already given them everything owed them more. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stood there, listening to my grown children explain why my life mattered less than their father's comfort. I remember thinking, if I give in now, I will disappear forever. So I packed my suitcase. I walked upstairs while my children stayed seated at my table, stunned that I had finally refused to bend. And when I boarded that plane, I didn't know it would cost me every relationship I had built with the 4 people I loved most in the world. But I went anyway, because for the first time in my life, I chose myself. And that choice would change everything. I was 22 years old when I married Robert. I had just graduated college, still carrying the quiet confidence of someone who believed her life was about to begin. I wanted to teach. I wanted my own classroom, my own name on the door, my own sense of purpose. But life didn't wait for plans to mature back then. It rushed you forward and expected you to keep up. I got pregnant during our senior year. And in those days, that meant one thing: marriage. Quickly, quietly, without questions. Robert was already older than me, steady, practical, admired by his family. He came from a traditional household where roles were clear and unquestioned. Men worked, women managed the home. His mother, Patricia, made that expectation clear from the first dinner I attended at their house. She smiled when she spoke, but her words carried weight. A good wife knows where she's needed, she told me once, placing a serving dish in front of me like an assignment. When our first son, James, was born, my teaching dream slipped into the background. Not officially, no one said I wasn't allowed, but subtly, persistently. There was always another reason to wait, another bill, another responsibility, another reminder that Robert was the one earning money now. Lisa came 2 years later. Then the twins, Rebecca and Tom, 3 years after that. 4 children in 6 years. My world shrank into schedules and meals and laundry cycles. I learned how to function on little sleep, how to multitask without acknowledgement, how to carry emotional weight quietly. Robert worked long hours as an accountant, and when he came home, he was tired. Too tired, he said, to help with bedtime routines or weekend activities. Whenever I mentioned going back to school or getting a part-time job, Robert would sigh and list everything he paid for. The mortgage, groceries, school supplies, clothes, utilities, as if love could be measured in receipts. Patricia didn't help. She appeared at our house without calling, inspecting my kitchen like a supervisor. She pointed out dishes in the sink, toys on the floor, crumbs on the counter. She compared me, always unfavorably, to other wives she knew. Robert never defended me. He nodded. Later, he asked why I couldn't keep things more organized. I learned to swallow resentment early. I told myself stability mattered more than fulfillment, that my children needed consistency. That sacrifice was part of motherhood. The breaking point came years later, when the twins were in high school. I had started taking night classes at the community college, quietly working toward a teaching certificate. One evening, Robert came home to find me studying at the kitchen table instead of cooking dinner. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how long I'd been working toward this. He picked up my textbooks and threw them into the trash. He told me I was selfish for putting myself above my family. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in our marriage. But I stayed. I stayed until all 4 children graduated high school, until they started college or jobs, until I believed they were steady enough not to be shaken by divorce. The day Tom moved into his first apartment, something inside me went quiet. I had given 28 years to a marriage that had never made room for me, and I had nothing left. I just didn't know yet that Robert was already preparing to leave. I didn't leave Robert. He left me. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. It was a Thursday in March when he came home from work carrying a manila envelope instead of his briefcase. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. He just placed the envelope on the counter like he was setting down groceries. Divorce papers. He said he had met someone at the office. Her name was Crystal. She was younger. She understood his values. She shared his vision of what marriage was supposed to look like. What he didn't say, but what became obvious soon enough, was that she expected less resistance, less ambition, less voice. Crystal was pregnant, with his child. Robert moved out that weekend. I remember standing in the doorway watching his car pull away, realizing that after 28 years of loyalty, patience, and sacrifice, I wasn't even worth a conversation about what had gone wrong. The divorce dragged on for 2 years. Robert fought me on everything. The house, the retirement accounts, even my car. His lawyer argued that because I hadn't contributed financially, I didn't deserve half of what we'd built together. I sat in conference rooms listening to strangers debate the value of my life's work. My lawyer fought back, but it was exhausting. I ended up with the house and a modest settlement, just enough to start over if I was careful. I sold the house. At 52, I went back to school full-time. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I studied late into the night, surrounded by students young enough to be my children. I earned my teaching degree and took a job at an elementary school nearby. I moved into a small apartment within walking distance. For the first time in my adult life, I lived alone. I taught 3rd grade during the day and tutored after school to make ends meet. The work was hard, but it mattered. I woke up every morning excited to go somewhere that needed me for who I was, not for what I provided. That was when I met Marcus. We met at a teachers' conference 2 years ago. He was a recently retired principal, kind-eyed and thoughtful. His wife had passed away from cancer years earlier. We started talking over lunch about education policy, then about books, then about life. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. Marcus had 3 grown children, David, Jennifer, and Paul. They welcomed me without hesitation. No comparisons, no expectations, just warmth. We married last year in a small ceremony with only our children present. Robert and Crystal weren't invited. I thought the hardest chapters were behind me. Then Robert had a stroke, and suddenly, old patterns began creeping back into my life. Quiet assumptions, unspoken expectations, familiar guilt. My children started calling, not to ask how I was, but to explain why I needed to help their father. They spoke carefully at first, practically. They said Crystal was overwhelmed, that Robert needed help, that they were exhausted. And underneath it all was the unspoken belief that I would step in, because I always had, because I was their mother, because they didn't yet understand that the woman who once disappeared for them was finally gone. The first call came from James. It was early evening, the hour when the day finally quiets down and you think you might get to breathe. I was grading papers at the dining table, red pen in hand, when my phone rang. His name lit up the screen, and something in my chest tightened before I even answered. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Dad had a stroke," he said. His voice was tight, controlled. "He's been in the hospital for 2 weeks. The doctors say he'll recover most of his functions, but he needs help, real help." I remember gripping the edge of the table, feeling the room tilt slightly. James explained that Robert couldn't bathe himself properly yet, that he needed help eating, remembering his medications, getting dressed. Crystal was still working full-time, he said. She couldn't afford to quit. They had 2 young kids now. Emma was 7, Luke was 5. "She's doing the bare minimum," James said. "She leaves him a sandwich and goes to work." She moved him into the guest room because his medical equipment was too noisy. There was a pause. "You live closest," he added. 15 minutes away. We were hoping maybe you could go by twice a week, just to make sure he's okay." The words hung there, heavy and familiar. I closed my eyes. "James," I said carefully, "your father divorced me 8 years ago. Crystal is his wife. Caring for him is her responsibility, not mine." Silence. Then, quietly, "I can't believe you're being this cold about the father of your children." That was the moment something shifted. The next day, Lisa called. She was crying before I even said hello. She told me she had been at Robert's house the night before. He looked terrible, she said. Greasy hair, dirty clothes. He'd lost weight. Crystal was working late shifts now and barely home. Please, Lisa begged. Just a few hours a week. My marriage is already suffering. I can't do this anymore. I told her the same thing I'd told James. The calls kept coming. Rebecca was blunt, accusatory. She said I was being selfish, that I was still bitter about the divorce. She pointed out that I was on summer break from teaching and had plenty of time. What kind of mother puts her own vacation ahead of her children's needs? She demanded. Tom was the last to call. He sounded exhausted, not angry, just worn down. I get why this is complicated for you, he said. But we're drowning. Our wives are angry. Our kids barely see us. We're driving back and forth every night. We need you. Then Patricia started calling. 81 years old and still sharp-tongued. She reminded me of everything Robert had provided during our marriage. She said it was my turn to return the favor. She said I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't step up. Things escalated when Crystal banned my children from the house. Lisa had confronted her about Robert's weight loss. Crystal snapped back that she was doing her best while working full-time and raising 2 children. She told them they were ungrateful and demanding. She said they weren't welcome back until they apologized. My children panicked. They couldn't check on their father anymore. They relied on Crystal's brief defensive updates. James drove by one night and saw Robert sitting alone in a dark living room. Lisa tried calling Robert's phone, but Crystal had taken it away, saying the ringing disturbed the kids' sleep. Then came the breaking point. All 4 of my children showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning. They sat around my kitchen table, the same one where I'd fed them for years, and took turns listing everything that was wrong. Robert's weight loss, bed sores, being left in soiled clothes, Crystal's neglect. Then the focus shifted. Rebecca scoffed at my upcoming trip to Greece. Lisa said I was choosing my new marriage over my children. James said he couldn't believe I'd pick a vacation over family. Tom said Marcus would understand if I canceled. I listened, quietly. Then I stood up. Robert is not my family anymore, I said. He made that clear when he left me. Crystal is his wife. This is her responsibility. Lisa started crying. Rebecca called me bitter. James said I was punishing their father. Tom said I was disappointing them as their mother. I walked out of my own kitchen and went upstairs to pack. For the first time in my life, I didn't stay to explain myself. Packing for Greece felt surreal. My hands moved on autopilot, folding dresses, setting aside sandals, tucking travel documents into a folder, while my mind lagged somewhere behind, replaying my children's voices over and over again. Selfish, cold, a bad mother. I had heard versions of those words before, from Patricia, from Robert, from the quiet, disappointed silences that followed every time I tried to claim something for myself. What hurt now was that they were coming from the 4 people I had built my entire life around. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my suitcase, half packed, my chest tight in a way that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, just a moment, I wondered if this was the price of finally saying no. If maybe this was what choosing myself was always going to cost. Downstairs, I heard Marcus's voice. He had come in from the garage and found my children still sitting at the kitchen table. I could hear the low rumble of his calm, steady tone through the floorboards. You need to leave, he told them. You're upsetting her. James snapped back that Marcus didn't understand because Robert wasn't his ex-husband. That's exactly why I do understand, Marcus replied. She doesn't owe him anything. When Marcus came upstairs, I was standing by the closet, gripping a hanger so tightly my knuckles were white. He crossed the room without speaking and pulled me into his arms. I didn't cry. Not yet. He asked me, gently, if I wanted to cancel the trip. He said he would understand. That Greece could wait. That family crises were complicated. I shook my head. No, I said, but I'm scared. Of what? Of losing them, I admitted. All of them. Marcus didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me everything would be okay. He just said what I needed to hear. They're scared too. But fear doesn't give them the right to demand your life back. The silence that followed my children's departure was heavy. By Thursday, my phone felt like a threat. Missed calls, voicemails I couldn't bring myself to listen to. Patricia called to tell me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Crystal called for the first time since Robert's stroke, accusing my children of harassing her and threatening to call the police if they didn't stop. Then I saw 17 missed calls from my children. I listened to one voicemail. It was Lisa. She was sobbing, barely able to form words. Robert had been taken back to the hospital. His condition had worsened. She said it was my fault, that she would never forgive me if something happened to him. I sat on the bed, staring at my phone until Marcus came in and knelt in front of me. He offered again to cancel the trip, and again I said no. I called my children back. None of them answered. I left messages saying I was sorry Robert was back in the hospital, that I hoped he recovered quickly, that I would check on them when I returned. 2 hours later, Patricia called again. She said the hospital was investigating Robert's care at home. She said it was all my fault for not stepping in. She called me a terrible mother, a worse ex-wife. Then she hung up. That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus's breathing beside me, my mind spiraling through every possible outcome. I questioned myself in ways I hadn't in years. Should I have gone over just once? Should I have helped temporarily? Was I being cruel? But every time I imagined myself bathing Robert, feeding him, managing his medications, I felt something inside me collapse. I could see the old life rushing back in, my needs dissolving, my marriage strained, my boundaries erased. The next morning, Marcus loaded our suitcases into the car. Our flight left the next day. I stood in the doorway of our house, keys in hand, feeling the weight of what I was choosing and what I was leaving behind. I didn't know yet that this decision wouldn't just fracture my relationships. It would pull me into a storm I never could have predicted. Greece was supposed to be an escape. For 10 days, it almost was. The sea was impossibly blue, the kind of color that doesn't exist in memory, only in the moment. Marcus and I walked along narrow stone streets, shared plates of food we couldn't pronounce, laughed over cheap wine at sunset. For the first time in years, my mind was quiet. I slept through the night. I woke without dread. I didn't think about Robert. I didn't think about my children. I let myself believe, briefly, that distance would soften things, that time would cool their anger, that when I came home, we would talk like adults and figure something out. I was wrong. The moment I turned my phone back on at the airport, it vibrated nonstop in my hand. 43 missed calls, over 100 messages, names stacked on the screen like accusations. James, Lisa, Rebecca, Tom, Patricia, Crystal. Even people I hadn't heard from in years. Old neighbors, former coworkers, distant relatives. My stomach dropped. The first voicemail I listened to was from James. He had left it 3 days after we landed in Greece. "Dad's back in the hospital," he said, his voice hoarse and furious. "He was dehydrated, malnourished. Adult Protective Services are involved now. This is on you." Lisa's message came next. She was crying so hard her words blurred together. Robert had developed pneumonia. The doctors were worried his immune system was too weak to fight it. She called me a monster for choosing a vacation over her father. Rebecca didn't cry. She shouted. She said everyone in town was talking about me, that she was ashamed to call me her mother, that if Robert died while I was drinking cocktails on a cruise ship, she would never forgive me. Tom's message was quieter, exhausted. He said he understood why I'd gone, but he wished I'd stayed to help them figure out a solution. He said they were falling apart trying to manage everything. The messages from Patricia were venomous. She said I was evil, vindictive, that she was telling everyone exactly what kind of person I was. Crystal's messages stopped me cold. She was apologizing. She admitted she hadn't been taking good care of Robert. She said she was overwhelmed, working full-time, raising 2 young children, trying to manage a man who needed constant care. She said she had asked her own mother for help, but had been refused. She couldn't afford a private nurse. She didn't know what else to do. By the time we landed, my hands were shaking. Marcus watched my face change as I listened. He took my phone gently and wrapped his arm around me. "We'll deal with this," he said, "but I'm glad you had those 10 days. At home, the situation exploded. The local paper had run a story. Local man hospitalized due to alleged neglect. My name was mentioned. My refusal to help. My children's pleas. A lawyer's letter sat on the counter, formal and cold. Crystal was being investigated for criminal neglect of a vulnerable adult. The letter asked me to provide a statement. It suggested that my refusal to help might demonstrate that Crystal had asked for assistance but been denied. That was when I realized this was no longer just family drama. It was legal. I called my children. James didn't answer. Lisa screamed when she picked up, then hung up. Rebecca refused to speak to me. Tom explained what had happened while I was gone. After I left, my children had contacted Adult Protective Services themselves. They told investigators that Robert's wife was neglecting him and that his ex-wife, me, had refused to help despite repeated requests. The social worker arrived unannounced. Robert was alone, unwashed, confused, wearing the same clothes for days. There was little food in the house. An ambulance was called immediately. The investigation widened, not just Crystal's care, but everyone's role. Why the adult children hadn't found professional care, why I hadn't intervened. Marcus and I hired a lawyer the next morning. He told me I had no legal obligation to care for my ex-husband, but he warned me that morally, people would judge me harshly. Adult Protective Services might still interview me. And they did. The social worker's voice was calm but relentless. She wanted to understand my relationship with Robert, my divorce, my children's requests, why I had chosen not to help. Each question felt like a needle. That night, for the first time since all of this began, I cried. I cried for the man Robert had become, for the children who now saw me as their enemy, for the certainty that whatever happened next, there would be no clean ending. The boundary I had drawn had triggered an avalanche, and there was no way to stop it now. The darkest part wasn't the investigation. It wasn't the newspaper articles, the lawyer letters, or even the way my name had become shorthand for betrayal in my own town. It was the silence. After the interviews, after the calls, after the initial fury burned itself out, my children stopped reaching for me altogether. No angry voicemails, no accusations, just nothing. That absence was heavier than any insult. I would pick up my phone throughout the day, half expecting to see James's name or Lisa's, or even Rebecca's sharp, cutting messages, but the screen stayed blank. The woman who had once been the center of their world had become irrelevant overnight. I moved through my days on autopilot. I went back to my classroom. I smiled at my students. I graded papers. I listened to children argue over crayons and felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, wondering how it was possible to lose your own children while they were still alive. At night, I lay awake replaying everything. What if I had gone just once? What if I had helped temporarily? What if that had been enough to change the outcome? The guilt crept in quietly, disguising itself as logic. Maybe I could have supervised professional care. Maybe I could have helped coordinate a nurse. Maybe I could have prevented Robert from deteriorating. And then another voice, older, steadier, would answer back. And then what? Would I have been pulled back into daily care, into managing appointments, medications, meals, into becoming the default solution again? I saw myself slowly disappearing, my marriage strained, my boundaries eroded, my hard-won independence slipping away one compromise at a time. Marcus noticed the change in me before I did. "You're punishing yourself," he said one night as we sat at the kitchen table, untouched cups of tea growing cold between us. "I let him suffer," I whispered. He shook his head. "You didn't cause his neglect. You refused to fix someone else's failure." But logic didn't stop the grief. Then the call came. Crystal had been charged with criminal neglect, up to 2 years in prison. I sat at the edge of the bed staring at the wall, numb. I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted anyone punished. I had just wanted to step out of a role that was killing me. Tom was the one who told me. His voice was different now, distant, formal. He said Robert was being discharged to a rehabilitation facility. He said Crystal's lawyer was arguing that she had asked for help and been refused, that my refusal was part of her defense. That was when I realized something else had been taken from me. My story. My decision, made to protect myself, was now being used to explain someone else's failure. Weeks later, a subpoena arrived. I was required to testify at Crystal's trial. I sat at the kitchen table, holding the envelope, while Marcus read over my shoulder. The weight of it pressed down on me until I felt physically ill. Testifying meant speaking publicly about my refusal. It meant facing my children in a courtroom. It meant choosing truth over reconciliation, because there would be no way to do both. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark listening to the quiet hum of the house and thought about the woman I had been for 28 years, the one who stayed, who swallowed anger, who made herself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. And I thought about the woman I was now, a woman who had finally said no, a woman paying for it with everything she loved. On the witness stand, I told the truth. I said Robert was my ex-husband. I said he divorced me to marry someone else. I said I had been asked to help and had refused. I said I believed his current wife should have sought professional care. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. When my children testified after me, their words cut deeper than any accusation ever could. They spoke of desperation, of exhaustion, of betrayal. They didn't look at me once. When Crystal was convicted, the judge's words echoed in my head. Legal duty, serious harm, vulnerable adult. In the hallway afterward, I tried to speak to my children. James walked past me. Lisa turned away. Rebecca shook her head in disgust. Tom paused, just for a second, then walked on. That was the moment I understood. I hadn't just lost their trust. I had lost my place in their lives. The turning point didn't come with relief. It came with clarity. Crystal was sentenced to 18 months in prison, eligible for parole after 9. Robert was transferred to a long-term care facility. The crisis, at least the version that had consumed everyone, was officially over. But nothing felt resolved. For weeks after the trial, I moved through life like someone learning how to inhabit a body that no longer fit its old shape. I expected anger to rise in me, defensiveness, the urge to justify myself. Instead, what settled in was something quieter and far more permanent. Acceptance. Tom called 2 days after the verdict. It was the first time any of my children had reached out since the courtroom. He didn't ask how I was. He told me Crystal had been taken into custody, that Robert would need at least 3 months of professional rehabilitation, that the insurance would cover most of it, but they'd be paying extra for upgraded services. He spoke to me like a distant relative, polite, factual, careful. I asked him if this meant we could talk, really talk. There was a long pause on the line. I understand why you did what you did, he said finally, but I don't think I'll ever see you the same way again. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. It wasn't anger, it was finality. A week later, I received notice that Adult Protective Services had closed their investigation into me. No wrongdoing. No legal responsibility. My lawyer said it was the best possible outcome. It didn't feel like a win. I tried one last thing. At Marcus's suggestion, I wrote letters, one to each of my children, not to defend myself, not to argue, just to explain. I acknowledged James's burden. I validated Lisa's fear. I responded to Rebecca's anger. I thanked Tom for his attempts at understanding. I told them I loved them, that I always would. None of them replied. Instead, Patricia called my cousin and said James had shown her my letter. She said she told him to throw it away. She said I was trying to rewrite history. That was when something inside me finally stopped fighting. I realized I had been clinging to the idea that if I explained myself well enough, clearly enough, gently enough, I could be forgiven. But forgiveness wasn't what they wanted. They wanted compliance. They wanted the woman I used to be, the one who absorbed responsibility until nothing was left. And she was gone. I began therapy. Not to fix my children, not to repair the family, but to grieve. The therapist listened as I told my story, not just the crisis, but the marriage, the years of erasure, the way saying no had felt both terrifying and inevitable. She said something that changed everything. You didn't choose against your children, she said. You chose against disappearing. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent decades teaching my children that a good woman sacrifices herself endlessly, that love meant endurance, that boundaries were negotiable. When I finally modeled something different, self-preservation, autonomy, they saw it as betrayal. Not because it was wrong, but because it shattered the version of me they relied on. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. I stopped reaching out. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped imagining reconciliation as something I could earn. And in that space where guilt used to live, I found something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in quiet, devastating increments. Returned mail, unanswered messages, conversations I was no longer invited into. The first thing I lost was my grandchildren. I didn't know it would happen that way. I assumed, naively, that whatever anger my children felt toward me, they wouldn't cut me off from the children who still called me grandma. Children I had babysat, baked for, read to, rocked to sleep. I sent birthday cards. Each one came back unopened. Returned to sender. James's handwriting. I sat at the kitchen table holding those envelopes like evidence of a life I no longer belonged to. 8 grandchildren. 8 small lives I was suddenly erased from, not because I had harmed them, but because I had disappointed their parents. Patricia made sure I knew. She told my cousin that my children had decided I was dead to them, that they had explained to their kids why grandma wasn't around anymore, that they didn't want their children exposed to someone who had abandoned family. It was astonishing how easily my story had been rewritten. Robert remained alive, though distant. I didn't know his condition. I didn't know if he recognized his surroundings anymore, or if the stroke had taken more than his mobility. I found out later, through third parties, that my children were taking turns staying overnight at the facility, exhausted, angry, bound together by shared resentment. They were still paying, just without me. Crystal was released after 9 months. She didn't reach out again. I imagined her rebuilding her life quietly, marked by the same isolation that now defined mine. 2 women blamed for the same man's decline. 2 women who had been expected to give more than they had left. Marcus watched me grieve without trying to rescue me from it. His children remained present. Jennifer invited me to her daughter's school events. David stopped by with groceries when he knew I'd had a hard week. Paul asked for my advice the way my own children once had. They didn't ask me to be smaller. They didn't expect me to bleed quietly. They just let me be. We traveled again, to Italy this time. 2 weeks of museums, food, quiet mornings, and evenings that belonged only to us. For the first time since everything had happened, I laughed without feeling like I was doing something wrong. While we were there, Patricia texted, "Robert had pneumonia again. My children were exhausted. It was still my fault." I didn't respond. That message didn't trigger guilt anymore. It triggered recognition. Nothing I did would ever be enough. When we returned, I found a letter from an estate planning attorney in my mailbox. Robert had updated his will. I wasn't included. The lawyer wanted to make sure I understood that I had no claim. I called and told him I didn't want anything, that I had no intention of contesting anything, that my life was stable, secure, and complete without Robert's assets. The lawyer sounded surprised. That letter confirmed something I had suspected for years. Robert never stopped seeing me as a threat, even after divorcing me, even after replacing me, even after all of this. He still believed I wanted something from him. He still didn't understand that what I wanted was peace. The final confirmation came in a grocery store aisle. Lisa stood ahead of me in line. I recognized her instantly. When she turned and saw me, her face went blank. Not angry, not sad. Empty. She paid and walked out without a word. I felt a strange sense of relief. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I was no longer a mother in waiting, no longer a grandmother on pause, no longer someone hoping to be restored. I was simply a woman who had survived. My children lost their image of me. I lost them. And the truth, quiet, uncomfortable, undeniable, was that neither of us could have both. I'm 59 years old now. I teach 3rd grade. I wake up early, pack my lunch, and walk into a classroom where children still believe adults are supposed to protect themselves as well as others. I'm married to a man who listens, who asks before assuming, who never confuses love with sacrifice. I live in a house that feels calm, not tense. I make my own decisions about how to spend my time, my money, my energy. I travel. I laugh. I rest. I don't have a relationship with the 4 children I raised or the 8 grandchildren I once adored. I don't know if Robert is still alive. I don't know if Crystal has found stability after prison. I don't know if my children ever question the story they tell themselves about me. And I no longer chase those answers. For most of my life, I believed being a good woman meant being endlessly available. That love was proven by how much pain you could absorb without complaining. That boundaries were selfish and silence was strength. I was wrong. Sometimes love looks like stepping away. Sometimes being a good mother means refusing to model self-destruction. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no, even when it costs you everything you thought defined you. My children made their choice. I made mine. They chose loyalty to their father at any cost. I chose to stop disappearing. Neither of us could have both. I don't feel proud of the losses. I don't celebrate estrangement. I don't pretend this path was painless. But I know this. If I had said yes, I would have lost myself completely. And I refuse to apologize for surviving. Next spring, Marcus and I are going to Japan. We'll see cherry blossoms and walk through temples and eat street corner sushi. We'll take pictures no one else will see and create memories that belong only to us. That's the life I choose now. Not the family that rejected me, but the family that chose me. Not the past I can't change, but the future I can still build. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough.